Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Hardin. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International. And I want to thank everyone from here in the United States to Ukraine who has joined us today for this discussion. A quick housekeeping note. Our event today is being offered in English and Ukrainian. And to listen along to simultaneous interpretation in Ukrainian, simply hit the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Recordings in both languages will be available following the event. We'll take audience questions at the end of our discussion, and to ask a question, simply submit them to the Q&A function, again at the bottom of your screen. When Russia invaded Ukraine a second time 7 months ago, its leaders did not expect the Ukrainian state and society to hold together, but hold together they did. Ukraine sprang into action, launching one of the largest humanitarian responses under fire in modern history. Civil society and volunteer networks housed, fed, and moved millions of their fellow citizens to safety. The initial relief operation was so successful because it was organized and led by Ukrainians. And while this may seem like common sense, during a war, humanitarian assistance is mostly, delivered by international aid agencies. For years, the aid community has promised to put local entities in charge of these efforts. Ukraine offers an incredibly remarkable and even golden opportunity to finally make good on these commitments. Unfortunately, as we have documented in our recent report, Localizing the International Response in Ukraine, this opportunity may be slipping away. For example, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the largely volunteer efforts to sustain themselves. Again, this may seem odd as donors have generously pledged support for Ukraine. More than 12 billion is making its way to help Ukrainian citizens inside the country deal with the humanitarian challenges they are facing. However, almost all this money is flowing first to international aid agencies. Next to nothing is going directly to the Ukrainians who led the initial response. As donations flood in, United Nations agencies and international non-governmental organizations are supersizing their own budgets and their staff. Dozens of foreign NGOs have grown from tiny footprints in Ukraine to multi-million-dollar operations. The result is an aid economy in which comparatively costly foreign humanitarian organizations hold the purse strings and make the decisions. Nothing about this challenge is new. Donors and aid agencies have long wrestled with how to avoid building parallel administrative systems while running a major humanitarian response. And these systems can undermine national institutions and ownership of aid delivery. Ukraine has a strong state, a relatively robust social safety net system, and a rich civil society. Collectively, these institutions offer an ideal chance to avoid the mistakes of the past for humanitarians. Nevertheless, donors are falling back into old habits. So why is all this happening, and what does it look like on the ground? Today, we have 4 distinguished panelists joining us to help discuss these questions. Oksana Kuiantseva is the program manager at Vostok SOS. She joined the organization at the beginning of the second invasion here and Vostok has been very active in the east of the country. She coordinates the distribution of food and non-food items for internally displaced people for the organization. Sasha Galkin is the president of Right to Protection, a Ukrainian nonprofit that protects the human rights of vulnerable populations, the internally displaced, and the stateless. And Tetiana Stawnychy is the president of Caritas Ukraine. Since the onset of the violence, Caritas Ukraine has provided emergency services to 1.3 million people. Before becoming president of Caritas Ukraine, Tetiana worked for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And finally, Nicholas Noe is the director of the Exchange Foundation and has been a partner and consultant with Refugees International over the summer. He has worked for almost 20 years in the NGO sector, principally in Lebanon and Tunisia, and regularly provides analysis and commentary to the international media. And he's spent a great deal of time on the ground in the last couple of months in Ukraine. Oksana, if it's okay, I'm going to turn to you first. Vostok SOS has been on the front lines of this crisis since its inception. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience over the last 7 months and how your organization and other Ukrainian groups responded to the humanitarian crisis and how you were thinking about the next phase of the crisis to come?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Hardin, for giving me the place and the time to talk about what we have been doing since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I would like to start from the very beginning of Vostok SOS. It was founded in 2014 as the answer to the Russian aggression, and was our actions always were aimed to protect people affected by war. And during 8 years, we have been covering needs of people in Donetsk and Lugansk region. But since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we had to relocate our offices that were placed in Kiev, Severodonetsk and Mariupol to Uzhhorod due to the war. And also that's why all the team, we are IDPs that are also people affected by war, and we are trying to help the same people facing the same problems. What we have been doing, we started delivery humanitarian aid, and also we started the evacuation process. Right now, the number of evacuated people from the Donetsk region, from the front line, is more than 30,000 people, and among them, around 3,000 people are immobile, elderly people. They need some special medical assistance and the places where to stay. We do a lot of things, and actually, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we had to grow our team very rapidly, and from 15 people now we grew up to 100 plus people in the team, and it was really challenging to operate with so many people and doing so many tasks. We had to work and we had to set up our hotline, and now we are receiving daily requests with very many things, and the requests are about humanitarian aid, about evacuation. We also provide psychosocial support, we provide legal support, and this is what people face, because problems that they face because they lose their documents. We work with deoccupied deliberated territories, and we see that there is a real humanitarian crisis there. Speaking up about challenges, yes, first of all, it's about new partnerships with a lot of local NGOs that help us to deliver in very different regions. It's needs assessment stage on very different topics, like what is really needed. And it's for sure a lot of grant projects and programs that we have to participate in, because due to the fact that we grow up and we have new priorities, for sure we have to again start a lot of contacts and make this fruitful collaboration from the both sides, with the donors and from the other side with local NGOs, and for sure with the representatives of local authorities. It's very important to make these all processes transparent, to make them really useful for those people who need support, and that's what we are doing right now, and we are really proud of what we can do, and the level of support that, for example, European countries provide to Ukraine. And also, I should mention that since the 2014, we are documenting war crimes, and we have already made one mission to the deoccupied territories of Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kiev region, and we presented the results. We were speaking up about what we have seen there, what problems people face there, and now in regards to the deoccupation of Kharkiv region, we are also working on new perspectives, yes, how to support these people, how to evacuate them in the beginning of the winter, and what we have to do to provide them with the basic needs. I think this can be all from my side, to not take too much time.
Thank you, Oksana. That's great. Tetiana, as the president of Caritas Ukraine, you've had a bird's eye view of sort of the wider humanitarian response. What has been the role of the international aid community, and what has gone well in that partnership, and what are the challenges? Do Ukrainians have a seat at the table where decisions are made, and what needs to change going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Hardin, for the question, and also thank you for the opportunity to be here with my colleagues from Ukraine. It's a great honor for me. So in terms of the international organizations, that are working, when I started, when we were preparing for the war in Ukraine, we were thinking, well, what would happen if there would be a large-scale invasion? And I was taking counsel with some of my friends who had more experience working internationally outside of Ukraine. And I was getting, very nervous right as leading up to the moment. And they all told me, don't worry, the first month, nothing happens. Yeah, because there's just chaos, and then after a month, everybody clicks in and things start to work. I guess this is how she explained that the system works. I think that the difference, though, in Ukraine was, again, as you mentioned in the beginning of your comments, is that the situation in Ukraine somehow showed itself to be very different, that there was this fabric of society that held in that initial impact, in that initial response, and that was responding immediately. And it happened on a lot of different levels. Yeah, it was happening actually on a local level. Yeah, I can tell you about our centers in Caritas. So we had been preparing our local centers. We're a network of organizations inside the country. I think one of the largest that's spread out throughout the country. So at that time, we were working with 19 of our centers. And the first initial days, we couldn't even do any procurements to get the things that we needed to help people. But those needs were supplied by local people. Our centers were flocked with supplies from people just bringing food, food, Pampers, anything for children, clothing. As people were starting to come through our centers in transit, we were able to provide help immediately because of the local response. Of course, as you mentioned, local response, it starts to fizzle out. Maybe not to fizzle out, but it loses steam. Yeah, there's only so much that you can do in a moment, especially if somehow you are part of the drama. Yeah, it's different when somebody comes in from abroad and is delivering aid, and it's different when you're in country, and then you're both the one who's struggling through everything that's happening in the country, and at the same time you're helping people. So I think what was interesting for us was that in some ways that was both a challenge, and at the same time it was a way for people to regain their agency. Yeah, and this is where we get to the point about these larger humanitarian aid agencies. I think that they just have a different nature. Yeah, they don't, they're large. They have certain bureaucracies that they need in order to keep transparency, to keep things in order, and it takes them longer to take a turn. Yeah, when something unexpected or maybe unprecedented happens. Whereas local organizations are more nimble. Yeah, they're smaller, they're quicker, they're embedded inside of community, and so they have these additional contacts and networks that they can count on in order to be able to respond. And that's certainly what we found as an organization. And you mentioned that I have a bird's eye view. I'm not sure that I have a bird's eye view because just as Vostok put a lot of effort into scaling their response, so did Caritas. So we initially were working with 19 centers. We expanded that to 37 centers throughout the country that we're working directly with in humanitarian response. And then we additionally expanded further through a parish network. Yeah, so as Caritas Ukraine, we represent the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in social aid activities, and we were able to access that parish network, which really allows us to go deep into the communities, into rural areas, providing a very wide net of answers to the needs. And, again, you can't expect a large international organization to come in and be able to do that. So, I mean, if you think about how is it that they respond quickly and effectively, they're able to do that by having large convoys, large procurements, getting a lot of things in. And in Ukraine, that initially wasn't working. Yeah, initially, what was working was the small efforts. Yeah, it was small, targeted efforts, local communities responding. It was all those horizontal, lateral connections that were saving the day, you could say. Yeah, so we had I could even tell you, the experience of our own network. Yeah, that we did not, as a national office, control everything that was happening inside the network. We didn't handle all the logistics. We actually had our local centers in the western part of Ukraine had relationships with the directors. The directors had relationships, and they were able to communicate to each other what the needs were in the eastern part of Ukraine. And we were sending, for example, in addition to helping people in all our centers, we were sending transports back into the east. And we were able to do that by creatively looking for solutions and by keeping the things that we're sending there in smaller quantities, not huge quantities. So, for example, just to give you an example of a creative solution that we found initially, there were all these people, the trains that were coming out and evacuating people, and the passenger trains were going back empty. And so we actually used the passenger trains going back empty to fill them up with humanitarian aid and send it back. The only thing that requires a lot more work, because you can't use the normal forklifts and things that you would use for cargo trains. So you had to have actually volunteers, local people who would come, and they would help you to get all the packages onto the train and then also to get them off. So, I know that there's been a lot of discussions about the particular Ukraine response. And I think that there are a lot of lessons that could be learned about both localization and about how to give local organizations the agency to be able to respond and keep that agency with them. That's been one of the topics that I bring up often when I have a chance, is to talk about how part of the, if you think about humanitarian aid, so when you're giving a person aid, you're talking about human dignity, you're talking about making sure that people can restore their agency and work. It's the same thing with local organizations. You just take that same principle that you try and provide assistance in the way that helps them also to stand on their feet and to keep feeling that agency and to keep feeling their ability to be able to respond. So I think I veered a little bit off topic, but maybe I touched on a few main points that would be useful for the conversation.
Tetiana, that's great. No, thank you very much. That's perfect. Sasha, let's sort of look at, Tetiana's just described, sort of in pretty impressive detail, like how this local civil society, almost like horizontal effort, right, across the country sort of stood up and responded to the crisis. And now we have some of the much larger international NGOs, international aid agencies, like making their way in and being to really sort of stand up their operations. And there are comparative advantages in terms of like access to supply chains and things that can be moved across the border. But from your perspective, where do you see sort of, the touch points between those two initiatives? What's working well, but also where are the challenges and problems? And the thing is, we've also heard a great deal now in the last couple of months, from the international side about the need to localize the response. But it's not clear that sort of reality on the ground is keeping pace with that rhetoric. So any sort of thoughts or observations you have to offer would be very welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for this great opportunity to share my view on specifically on localization in Ukraine. First of all, I would like to say that Right to Protection, it's my organization, it's a good example actually of localization, because we started operating in Ukraine back to 2001 as an international Jewish organization, HIAS. So, and in 2013, we got localized and we got registered charity foundation. So, and since then, we are an independent agency providing legal aid, psychosocial assistance, cash assistance, in-kind assistance. Also, we do a lot of advocacy. So, and this actually model has seems to have been successful, but not many actually organizations have heard that have gone through this localization process here. So. We've been working with many international organizations since 2003, actually, and specifically in 2014, once the first actually breakout of the war happened. So it was a lot of international organizations that actually stepped in and started operating. So, and we've been working together pretty successfully, I would say. But what sometimes my biggest concern, given that what you have said, that in Ukraine there is a quite strong civil society and full-fledged government, operational government. So the international organizations want sometimes, and the UN actually, they try to substitute this existing structures here. So, and I see that if it's, but since 2000, for instance, and 22, from actually starting from February, they were even more organizations, international organizations, parachuting actually, and they started again the same actually operations. So they try to provide direct assistance to beneficiaries. Given the numbers, of course, it's a drop in the ocean. Though according to one of the recent surveys, so 90% of humanitarian assistance has been actually done by the civil society actually, and by volunteer groups rather than the UN and international organizations. So my view that it's the international organizations and large the UN may actually step in with expertise, with expertise from maybe different crises from other places. So with actually to help to structure sometimes and to help to roll out some assistance, but led by civil society in Ukraine, and of course some facilitation of funding. It would be a great help for civil society organizations, which could be actually triggered by these international organizations. So we've been working with some international organizations in such a format. So they do provide some expertise, and then they step out without any specific direct assistance, because on many occasions we actually have to compete with big international organizations, sometimes the UN. So, like for example, we've been working in Dnipro since 2000. Dnipro, it's a big city in the east, which is now one of the biggest hubs, humanitarian hubs in Ukraine. So we've been working there since 2015. We've been quite successfully there. So with our legal aid, with our advocacy, with protection monitoring, and we have built up relationships with the government, local government. So, but now we have to compete there with, for instance, Norwegian Refugee Council, Danish Refugee Council, International Rescue Committee, Polish Humanitarian Aid, because they do provide, for instance, legal aid direct. And we cannot compete because the donors actually are not very much willing to stick to the same salary scale as they do for the international organization. So we are in limbo because this is just a very simple issue of money. So we cannot afford ourselves to pay as high as international organizations do. So, and that it really triggers talent brain. And now, for instance, in particular in Dnipro, we are kind of in a catastrophic situation because we have lost almost 7 well-educated and well-trained lawyers we've been working with for almost 5 years with some of them. So it's a free world. I understand that, so people can, but this is, in my opinion, it's not a very fair play now. So because we have to compete with those who are just privileged from the very beginning. So this is maybe the biggest issue I have. And right now in terms of localization. So, and Hardin, sorry, what's your second question, sorry?
We've heard a lot from folks about sort of beginning to recognize that the challenge of localization, that, from very early on in this process, some of the first, sort of Ukrainians I was meeting with back in the mid-spring were talking about this incredible sort of mobilization of civil society and the amazing work that they were doing on the humanitarian front, saying we're delivering everything. And then as the aid sort of architecture sort of stood up a little bit over time, the international aid architecture, the critique has emerged that why can't we empower and continue to just do what was working before? And there is, people in the international aid community are beginning to pay some lip service to this and recognizing and saying, yes, we need to be focusing on Ukrainian capacity, but it's actually happening. Like, is that manifesting in sort of actions on day-to-day on the ground in terms of the way the international effort or side of the effort is being conducted?
The biggest, in my opinion, the biggest problem here that all this localization discussions are being actually discussed without civil society of Ukrainian civil society. So these are discussions between actually international organizations and UN. The local NGOs and national NGOs are not very much involved. We are kind of a strange animal in this respect. So we are just a part of the humanitarian country team. That's why we, anyway, we are part of these discussions. But in large, the civil society is a little bit omitted here. So, and of course, NGOs, local NGOs and national NGOs, even voluntary group, they really do not understand what does it mean, because everyone understands localization differently. On top of that, so they do not understand what kind of an added value for being localized or whatever, not being localized. So this is kind of a mess right now. We really miss a clear strategy. In my just humble opinion, it needs to be somehow governed by the maybe HCT or a wider group, including more and more grassroots and other organizations, just to have this transparent and clear discussion about that. So, and then to pave the way for some long-term prospects for that. So, and another point, that donors are not prepared. The donors are not prepared for localization, because they do urge international organizations and the UN to get localized as soon as possible. But on the other hand, the donors, let's say, funding structures for local organizations, not yet there. So that's we are missing this new, let's say, a new structure which really would allow to fund local organizations. Because we just, for instance, you may know about the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund. It was established a couple of years ago. So which is a great tool, of course, and it really allows relatively small organizations, those who know how to write applications, to apply for relatively big money. Recently 20 million was actually allocated for networking within this UHF. But again, it's networking through international organizations mainly, rather than national organizations. So I don't see a lot of tools on the table right now to really start this localization, some full-fledged localization in Ukraine. But again, so it's a long-term project. It's supposed to be really very seriously deliberated. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Nicholas, in your report, and I think we're going to drop that link into the chat so people can see it. You talk a lot about some of these problems that we're now discussing, and everything from this brain drain, right, on local organizations that and this is stuff that I've seen up close in a number of places, where the salary structure from an international organization draws talent away from the organizations that are from the country and context who are actually doing the work at the front lines of it. And then everything to this fact that, this sort of anecdote about how the strategy around localization in the country team and those discussions are happening without Ukrainian organizations being at the table, right? This is all symptomatic of some not insignificant challenges. Are there other elements or manifestations of this sort of failure to localize that sort of emerged to you in your work and in your report. And then we do hear a lot of folks saying the right things, right, about the need to shift power, resources, agency to the organizations and the civil society networks and the volunteer networks that have been leading this thing on the Ukrainian side for months. What are the challenges or obstacles to that you see in your work?
Thanks. And thanks to all the panelists as well, many of whom, provided a lot of really interesting insights over the last few months for our work. I'd say that the evidence of the failure to localize started bubbling out really with the Humanitarian Outcomes report in early June. A lot of people, have put out really good detailed work on this subject in the intervening weeks as well, and over the summer as well. So, our own report and our own observations are really building on a lot of that as well. And the evidence was and remains pretty clear. I mean, it is shocking, I think, that at the Humanitarian Country Team over the summer, only 2 of the 19 seats at the table were by Ukrainian organizations or were held by Ukrainian organizations. And actually, you have 2 representatives here that are the Ukrainian voices at the HCT, right? That is deeply problematic in any country context, in any crisis context, as it should be said. Most of our findings, if not all of our findings, are also problematic in a lot of other crises and a lot of other countries, which is to say that, a lot of these problems, the failure to localize, the obstacles are well known and well acknowledged. I think one of the key points that kept on coming up was an acknowledgement, and really in 20 years in different crises, I haven't seen a kind of broad acknowledgement by international staff, let's say, of INGOs, UN agencies in Ukraine, who all, acknowledged right away that the situation, the capacity of the Ukrainian private sector, public sector, and NGO, CSO sector was like nothing they had ever seen before, and that it was really time to do something different in this context. We should be doing it elsewhere, yes. There are different issues that are brought up here and there with some merit and some with less merit, but this was it. And if we don't get localization and the grand bargain right in Ukraine, then how do we have hopes to do it anywhere else, really? Because we've been kind of served up this opportunity. I mean, it was incredible to hear, people in Dnipro and Odessa and Kyiv and elsewhere, longtime humanitarian workers who were kind of shocked to find out that there wasn't a failed state in Ukraine, as but one example. And to some of their credit, I think it is important to acknowledge some of the pushbacks, especially from INGO folks, to the Humanitarian Outcomes report, to our report, and to others that worked on this subject over the summer, because they have several actually very important things to consider if we're going to try and get things on the right course. First of all, there are a number of international organizations that have had a long presence and have done tremendous work in Ukraine. So they're not all parachuting in. That's really important to stress. However, the flip side is, especially at the first few months, we saw hundreds of international organizations, and indeed some very large ones, that are now operating with huge budgets that went from 0 people and 0 budget in Ukraine to tens of millions or even more, tens of millions of dollars and hundreds of staffers, which is problematic on its face, I think. Another important pushback that we need to consider is that, a lot of the INGO staff, especially country directors that I spoke with in Ukraine, I think they did a really good job of pushing back at their own headquarters and with donors and pushing for a historically unprecedented level of flexibility, fastness, agility. Now, it may not be good enough for Ukraine and Ukrainians, but their argument is, we're doing things in Ukraine faster, more efficient, more locally, more partnerships faster, better, more money going, yes, from us and then to local entities, We're doing cash assistance programs in coordination with the state social safety net that we hadn't done in other contexts. This is actually a big step forward for us, and we were able to make this argument successfully back home at our HQ and with donors. So that is important. But at the same time, I think what Sasha brought up, and there's several other ancillary problems. At the same time, with all of the talk about ethical hiring practices around the grand bargain, there is a hiring bonanza that's happening, and we shouldn't, and it's deeply problematic. I met with people, and one person, as but one example, again, anecdotal, it's true. I think we need a lot more data on this for sure. But anecdotally, kept on seeing this. One head of office in Odessa, who worked for a major INGO, who had taken a large salary bump, but his former job was helping to run the port at Odessa, and this was right around the grain deal. This is just but one example. It's anecdotal, but I think we could all come up with a lot of examples, and I heard a lot of examples as well. You're not necessarily draining talent away, but you're diverting it. You're moving it from the organic Ukrainian institutions and structures, and you're attaching people and human resources and talent to foreign-led organizations that have strategic decision-making. And that, I think, is something that's problematic. I would also say, involvement in decision-making in the cluster meetings. Sasha brought up and others about how a lot of Ukrainian organizations don't see the need to get involved in these different coordination mechanisms, clustering, et cetera. I would just say, if I was a Ukrainian organization or running one or involved in one, if you look at the HCT, which is supposed to be the main kind of table for the country, and you only have 2 out of 19 of the organizations are Ukrainian, that's deeply problematic. If you then go down to cluster meetings and coordination meetings where translation, Ukrainian language, and lack thereof has been a problem, and also at the end of the day, you realize, I have limited capacity. I'm focused on, trying to get aid to folks that are in the middle of a war and a humanitarian catastrophe. And there's no certainty of whether or not I'm going to have a benefit for my organization. Is this going to lead to perhaps budget support? Because a lot of my folks are volunteers, have been working day in, day out for 7 months and are burned out or tired. Am I going to get budget support for that, et cetera? These are all questions that unfortunately are not being answered. But there's also a final kind of pushback, and there are several others that we can consider and that are in the report, but that I think is really important to bring up. And it's one that came up again and again, and it would be great to hear from our panelists about this, which is, well, twofold. One is the central problem being donors and donor requirements. And, for example, ECHO, for example, the main conduit of European Union funding, legally cannot directly grant to a Ukrainian organization to give them cash directly. They have to go through a European, let's say crudely, a European or at least a European officed entity. But Ukraine and Moldova, for that matter, are candidate countries now for the EU. Perhaps it's time, to borrow a phrase, to break some bureaucratic China and do a demonstration program, do a pilot program. So donor requirements is, I think, the top sort of barrier. But then there's something else it doesn't have to do with the internationals, which is really important to deal with forthrightly. And I encouraged people from all the organizations that I met over the summer to really start talking about this in a frank manner, which is the high degree of mixing between military and civilian aid. There are a lot of questions from Ukrainians that I met about there being even perhaps a legal need to support the troops at the front with food aid, for example. There was also, I think, a lot of, frankly, if it was my country at war, I'd probably feel the same way, which is, yeah, we need to feed our troops at the front just as much as we need to feed folks that are fleeing from the front. This high level of mixing is problematic for humanitarian actors, and especially INGOs and UN agencies all over the world. because of the principles of neutrality and impartiality. And I think that, we really need to think about, frankly, how to deal with this, especially if more aid is to be localized. That's one. And I think a really interesting pathway, and maybe we can consider this, and I'll stop here because I spoke a bit too long, is, a number of organizations, NGOs that I met in Ukraine, Ukrainian organizations, they would tell me, frankly, Nicholas, we're not going to separate aid. We believe in giving aid to our military as well as to civilians. But I'd say a large number of organizations that I met said, we would be willing to separate these two things, but we need budgetary support because that oftentimes costs extra money. And also maybe this is where international entities can help us to exactly see how we can do that. Now and in the future. So there's that possibility, but that needs strategic decision-making and a buy-in, especially from donors and the people that have the purse strings, and also from the INGOs and the UN agencies that want to go down this route. But, my last thing that I'll leave you with, I think Sasha and Tetiana and Oksana are being a bit kind in a way, but I'm quite concerned that right now, this is kind of the best that it can get, in the sense that so much aid has come, all right? What I'm worried about is 6 months, 2 years, 5 years down the road, when maybe there's less aid coming in, and a lot of these arguments get mobilized, which can undercut humanitarian aid support for Ukraine, and where Ukrainian organizations aren't able to comply with international donor requirements because they never were actual grantees in full, rather than just sub-grantees or partners. That's where I think, we got to get ahead of this curve. And we also got to get ahead of it because these budgets and the practices are getting baked in, and they're going to be really hard to dislodge, especially because international organizations, UN agencies, and INGOs are seeing budgets cut around the world. And Ukraine represents a place that extremely well funded, and it's a huge incentive to kind of continue with this path forward. Thank you. Sorry, and I spoke a bit too long.
Thanks, Nicholas. That's great. Oksana, let me just, I see your head nodding on a couple of different points, right? One was on with respect to donor requirements, right? And the need for donors to make some serious progress there. And the other one was like, the sort of the issue of the mixing of assistance and the challenges that presents, but also what that question looks like from the perspective of a Ukrainian organization on the front line. Do you want to speak to either of those points?
Yes, I would like to, and thank you for giving possibility to respond to what Nicholas was talking about, because I would like to tell from the perspective of an organization that's working with very different donors. And to be honest, we have some partners with whom we have been working for 4, 5, 6 years before the full-scale invasion. And our partnership is so well organized that, for example, our Estonian partners, Mondo, they started to collect donations for us in Estonia at the very first day of the invasion. And it gave us, while we were evacuating our offices to the western part of Ukraine, while we were on the way, it gave us freedom, an opportunity to start looking for warehouses, to start looking for the office, and to really provide food, non-food items that they start to collect and send to Ukraine in a very flexible way. And that's exactly why we were unable to do this, because these were donations. Yes, we didn't have all the requirements of a grant program, for example, and then we could explain from the position of organization that know the needs what we can do with this money. And on the other hand, and this was just one example, and I think on the first week of the full-scale invasion, we were able to receive first cargos with food and non-food items and deliver them directly. On the other hand, right now the time passed and we started to apply for a lot of international organizations coming to us and offering us to be implemented partners in grant programs. And then we faced a lot of difficulties because, I mean, this is extremely important, but all time we have, for example, priority in localization or in geographic, yes, where this project can be implemented due to the idea of the donor, or for example, what should be distributed. And then it take just again short examples. Yes, we made the proposal in April, for example, and we implement right now, and the necessities of people, because of many bureaucratic procedures, and the necessities of people changed rapidly, yes, because now we are talking about winterization and many other necessities. That's why, yes, I completely agree with Nicholas that first of all, we really have to receive this opportunity to be more flexible with the fundings that we receive, because always organizations on the ground understand better what's going on and what should be supported. And on the other hand, yes, I think that a lot of organizations right now in Ukraine have enough capacity and experience to start to be the direct partner. I mean, without the extra. Yes, and speaking up about providing support to militarians and civilians, yes, here we are very stricted. We can support only civilians. It's the requirement of a lot of donors that we cooperate, and then we can do nothing, and we really do not give any chances. I mean, we just only focus on civilians, even when we understand that, for example, we know about some needs. So yes, that's really how it is on the field, on the ground. Yeah, from my side, that's it.
That's great. Thank you, Oksana. So we got some questions coming in from the audience, and note the audience, please go ahead and send them in using the Q&A function at the bottom. Sasha, one for you. So from the audience, we've sort of talked about the challenges, the pros and the cons of the international aid response and its relationship with Ukrainians who have been carrying the weight of this for the majority of the crisis. What would you want that relationship to look like? Like, what is the role of an international aid agency or international NGO or UN agency in the Ukrainian humanitarian response at this stage of the crisis? What should it be?
So it's a quite complicated question, because of course I don't know the whole kitchen, and of course off top of my head what is necessary to do, as I said from the very beginning. So I would prefer to see the UN and NGOs as advisors rather than direct implementers. So because we have civil society in Ukraine, we have quite strong and qualified, I would say, an expert environment, so that we can actually do it on our own, with of course support expert and of course funding support of the UN and NGOs. But again, as Oksana mentioned, so we are a few of organizations, frankly, those who know how to work with NGOs and the UN. The most of the civil society, just I mean grassroots, they have no clue how to deal with that. So that's why sometimes I believe that it's better just to have, as I said, so some donors, they might be able to develop some very simple and easy instruments in order to reach out these groups and to support them. Because now in terms of localization, it's not only money, of course. It has been here since 2014. It's been a lot of time to start this localization, and nothing happened. So, but now I believe that again. So, capacity building, it's okay, but now we need just something to support, because people are most of that volunteerism may last no longer than 6, 7, 8 months max. So then what is the next? So this is the biggest chunk of help. What would be next? So that's important point. So how we can support this volunteer groups and small NGOs, because as to my best knowledge, there is no now just some real instruments to do that from the side of donors, international donors. So I believe that's necessary to develop these instruments, and then of course to have a clear strategy for at least 5-6 years, how donors, the international community, and maybe big national organizations can actually plug in order just to help to develop this huge network. Now, these are humanitarian organizations. Some of them used to be actually human rights organizations, and they, in view of the war, they actually had to switch to humanitarian assistance. But at some point, they wanted also they would like to become again a human rights organization. So we have to take into account a lot of factors here. So, and to think about that, and of course, it's a huge laborious task, and it needs to be tackled by many different stakeholders. So, and I believe that it might work, not now, of course, but in future, and maybe it's some midterm prospect, hopefully. But for that there needs some real willingness of donors, of the international community, and some, let's say, holistic approach to that. Thank you. I'm over.
Yeah, well said. That's great. Tetiana, again, there's another question in the chat, which I think is another way of asking a very similar question, but on a sort of macro stage. We have a big donor conference coming up in October in Germany, I believe. What are your 1 or 2 messages or 3 messages to that donor conference about this issue, right? About trying to get resources, trying to empower, trying to put Ukrainian organizations in the driver's seat of what is a massive humanitarian response.
Yeah, thanks. I would really just be repeating all the good points that Oksana and Sasha have just raised. I think that they had outstanding observations. I think one of the main points, if I wanted to sum them up, yeah, it would be to, I'm sorry, there was whatever, air raid siren. One of the things that's important is to meet people where they are, yeah? So you meet organizations where they are in their organizational development. And I can tell you it works this way in our Caritas network, because we have a worldwide network also, yeah? But part of it is this accompaniment, yeah? So not coming in and doing it for them, not coming in and using local organizations to, to get to the local level, but coming in and accompanying. And I really loved the phrase that Sasha used when he talked about the role as advisors. Yeah. So I would see, I think we're talking about, 2 different things when you're talking about immediately now what we need. And then if you're talking about long-term perspective. Yeah. And if you're talking about this long-term perspective, it's really this kind of a lessening of the role of NGOs, of their translation of what the requirements are to local NGOs. It's a period of that lessening, and then local NGOs really taking on, the ones who want to take on institutionalization and want to really develop. Because as we mentioned, right now, what you have is lots of people who feel the need to do something. They want to be contributing to the effort, but they're not necessarily interested in creating an NGO that's going to be nationwide going forward in the next years. And so, you should have an approach to those people, and then you have a different approach to those who want to build their capacity, and grow. And I think that, I actually found in recent conversations with, with certain UN actors that there is this desire on their part to really listen and to really think about what is it that they need to do as an organization to help, in the response. Yeah, how to position themselves, to try and understand. So I think that there's a lot of hope on the road. And I really think that Ukraine can be an outstanding example and help really push through this localization through. Yeah, I think that, and then that would be a contribution, I think, to the whole worldwide effort of humanitarian aid.
Well said. Thank you very much. We're coming up a little bit on time. So what I'd like to do is just a very quick lightning round with our panelists. Just asking very briefly, what is the number one thing that you're thinking and worrying about right now, and that others in the international community need to be focused on in terms of support for the next phase of the humanitarian crisis? I mean, we're seeing what's happening in the East right now with winter coming. There are a lot of moving parts and pieces to this. So even separate from the localization agenda, what are the things that we need to be focused on and how best to support the effort in country? Nicholas, I'm going to start with you. Just I'm going to give the other panelists time to speak, but just very quickly for you, if you've got number one there, or is there something that's missing in this conversation so far about the localization effort from your report that you'd like to flag?
No, I just want to hit on, what can be done, right? Because I think that that's crucial right now, because we're running out of time, again, where budgets practices get baked in. And also there's an unfortunate arc of that happening when maybe humanitarian support and aid becomes more problematic in Western countries that are the main donors in the coming period. So, one, the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, the big pool fund, that's got to do a better job of getting more money to Ukrainian organizations. They've got to at least meet the 50% that they had last year before the war. It's unfortunately at 24%. They're trying to do more of it. It's got to be done. They got to devote more resources to that. The humanitarian country team, the main humanitarian table at the country, has got to have at least an even amount of Ukrainian entities and international entities, full stop. That does not take breaking bureaucratic China even. That should be an easy decision. Definitely pilot projects by USAID, ECHO. Guys, let's think outside the box. For 20 years, I've seen, and in this conflict, we see yet again, how the military folks are able to break bureaucratic China. They're able to rush all sorts of things in. They're able to do basically whatever they need under the justification that it's a military necessity. Well, let's do that in the humanitarian sector. Let's take some risks. There's no better place to do it. Let's do it now. If not here, then there's serious questions that the humanitarian community is ever going to live up to the grand bargain in other places. And also INGOs. Let's think INGOs together. It's not easy amongst INGOs, perhaps politically, but maybe there should be an INGO pool fund, for example, which will cut down on overhead costs, cut down on replicated staff across many INGOs, get together, pool that money, bring national organizations on board, and start turning over the organic control, the strategic decision-making, the budgets, and the ownership of these funds and programs to Ukrainians. As Sasha said, I think, and Tetiana flagged, that's a great analogy, is that the internationals at this point especially should be auxiliaries. They should be supportive of Ukrainian-owned projects, period. Sorry I went over again.
Yeah, I liked what Nicholas decided to talk about more than the question I asked. So if you all have got one, like either there's one concern or one fix, like the one thing that you want to see happen, let's go with that. And Oksana, I'm sorry, but I think I'm going to call on you first.
That's okay. It's pretty difficult to talk about just one thing. That's why let me talk about two things I have in mind. First of all, it's ongoing support of Ukrainian refugees outside Ukraine. Yep. It's extremely important because as long as, let's say, we do not spend our efforts and local efforts to support them, we have space, physically even space, like places where to live, where to go, and where to evacuate people from the front line. I mean, it's extremely important to still support refugees outside Ukraine. And if we are talking about situation inside Ukraine, or while we are working on evacuation, I would tell it's equipping and setting up places like spaces, shelters, but comfortable. I mean, whatever type of buildings that can be used for people to leave, just because there are a lot of IDPs, and that's one side, yes, and another side, we can evacuate people from the hotspots only in case that we know where to offer them to go. I mean, especially when we are talking about immobile people, elderly people, and all the vulnerable categories. We can take families with children from the shelters, yes, only if we provide them with a place where to stay this winter. And also in regards to the deoccupied territories, it will be impossible to stay for winter there. That's why all the territories, Kharkiv region, for example, that was deliberated right now, should be moved. These people should flee and stay somewhere. That's why this is from my point of view. It's my point of view.
Oksana, thank you. And thank you for raising the situation there in the newly liberated territories, right? Because that is what we're hearing is the level of destruction is such that it's very hard to imagine how people are going to stay put during what promises to be a pretty tough winter. Sasha?
I'm a little bit pessimistic right now, so because we have to be prepared for another wave of displacement, which actually is may exceed even 5 million. It's from the east, from the central. It depends very much on the scenario, of course. And civil society was already exhausted. So, and who is going to respond? That's why it's very much important to have now this support to civil society. I know this is kind of, I do not provide any solution for that, but I believe that it's all localization or whatever you may want to name it, but it's necessary to do right now. So we need just to be in a rush to provide more, let's say, not only funding, but support to civil society in Ukraine. Yes, that's it.
So back to how Nicholas said, like we have to use sort of parlance in the United States. We need to break some China very, very quickly to get those resources there, right? Because civil society has been the heart of this response for the last 7 months. And going into winter, how can you ask them to do more if we're not willing to find new ways of doing business to support them? Tetiana, can you close this out?
Sure. It'd be easy because I would support more or less what Oksana and Sasha said. I think the question of shelter is really key. And I would point out also, I know this has not been brought up so much, but the question of livelihood. So I think that there's a lot of people who are displaced who are ready, who want to do something. Yeah. And so the question is how can we engage them in solving some of the problems that are coming up in the humanitarian crisis?
Sasha, Tetiana, Oksana, Nicholas, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. And thank you for everything you're doing in your day jobs, day in and day out over this last 7 months and with winter coming up. We will stay on top of the story as much as we can. And we look forward to another opportunity to check in with you all and see what we can do to get the messages out. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.